welcome to our track talk on multimodal approaches to enrich patient journey mapping. Final day of the conference. I hope all of you had a really informative and learning experience over the last 2 days. And hopefully we can have a bit more discussion on something that's been kind of a staple of market research for several years now, which is patient journeys. What we're trying to present here is patient journey mapping, but looking at it from the different angles that have things other than just primary market research, and how that can help enrich the final outputs and give us a multi-layered and highly insightful patient journey map. So firstly, starting with the basics, what is patient journey? Why should we map it? It's a very important question because that decides how we go about doing it. The traditional methods of patient journey mapping that you probably already know. We'll go over a quick case study to see how multimodal approaches can be used, and it's one way of doing it. We'll talk about how different ways of multimodal approaches work, and then we'll conclude with what are the key takeaways from this. Let's say you're trying to colonize Mars, you first need to understand where the landing sites are, right? What are the areas of the planet where you don't encounter several storms all the time, or there's access to water, such things. So to get to the ultimate goal that we have with patient journeys, you have to start at a basic place, which is just mapping out really broad brushstrokes of onset of symptoms, presentation, diagnosis, treatment, and outcome. That's like the basic starting step. But once you start uncovering things and talking to patients, talking to healthcare providers, or even reading secondary data online, what you realize quickly is that it's not a straight line. It's kind of a meandering journey, and it can take one of several routes, and it depends on whom you ask, what their experiences are, and you start understanding soon that it's between each of these major stages, there are several different things that are happening that can be looked at as inflection points that decide which path the patient takes on their journey. So quickly you start realizing that there are several complexities to any given patient journey. And what's causing this, in a way, deviation from the central line, the central rigid straight path, are several influencing factors. So there are patient factors, as well as there are other factors that are outside the direct influence sphere of the patient or the physician. A lot of the patient factors revolve around their own disease state, how they perceive it, what their preferences are, what their family background is, what their support system is like, etc. And then there are several other factors as well, which relate to whether they have access, how much money they have access to, what kind of insurance plans they are on. And then, of course, there's the physician aspect of things, which also influences this patient journey. So once you want to start looking at what's exactly happening and how these influences are coming into play, we have to account for both perspectives. One is the physician perspective, the other is the patient perspective. And typically this takes the form of interviews, surveys, sometimes online discussion boards, and that's been traditionally how this has been approached. A lot of times we only get one perspective and try to kind of guess what the other side is, maybe to save money or do it quickly, or just because we feel that the patient journey is pretty straightforward and there isn't too much to it that we need multiple perspectives on. But if you really look at it objectively, physicians and patients do always bring unique perspectives. So they may agree a lot of times on several things, but unless you actually ask them, you can't be sure of that. For example, if you look at the physician's perspective, you will look at all those important stages that we discussed before, from presentation up through management treatment. But unless you look at the patient perspective, you wouldn't understand how the onset of symptoms began, how they discovered that something was wrong, what steps did they take, and how did they finally end up going to the physician who prescribed the product that you're interested in. From the physician perspective, again, you can identify certain decision points and drivers behind these points, such as why did they prescribe a certain drug, why did they do a particular referral, why did they decide to, say, start a next line of therapy, and so on. But again, the patient on the other side of it is going through all of this in their own way, learning things, developing their knowledge about the disease, which is highly influenced by the physician, by the way, and also undergoing different levels of emotional or different emotions that we felt along the way. So again, to exemplify that both perspectives are equally important, and certain things like what's the support ecosystem of the patient, who are the people caring for them, what role are they playing in the patient's life, you can get that only from the patient. So yes, we need to do the kind of basic or traditional patient journey mapping activities through surveys, interviews, et cetera, with patients as well as physicians. But once you start trying to peel back the layers more, you see that there are more and more things that can be explored and discovered. So I'm just going to illustrate this with the help of a case study which tried to map the head and neck squamous cell carcinoma patient journey. So the objective of the patient journey was, essentially this study was to map the patient journey, get the idea of the whole meandering path that a patient takes from symptoms to their final treatment and final outcome, but also identify the key stakeholder roles along the way, and also identify what leverage points exist for the novel product that our client was trying to launch. So drivers, barriers, and opportunities all along the way, right? So the way we approach this in a multi-phased way and using multiple different tools is that we first, we combined the power of three different methodologies. One was patient record forms that provide real-world data from a large pool of patients. Then we have the online discussion board with physicians, which was really key in trying to understand the interdisciplinary play between different specialties that treat this disease. Because head and neck cancer, for those of you who don't know, is treated with both chemo, radiotherapy, immunotherapy. So there's a lot of different options, and they're used at different stages in different ways by different physicians. So there was a lot of complex interplay of clinical decision making that had to be teased out. And we also conducted web-assisted telephone interviews, depth interviews, because the patient record forms and the online discussion boards are really good at giving you hard facts. But then you can start getting certain nuances through that, which you need further explanation for, which are best done with the web-assisted TDIs. And the way it was structured started with the pilot phase, where we essentially just used it to optimize the field material. So this was in the form of interviews, and the sole objective of it was to figure out in a select group of core countries, who are those physicians who we should be including in this research, and what kind of questions we should be asking them. We then went on to the next phase of the PRF collection, and which was expanded to all markets that we were interested in, and this was the main quantitative aspect of it. And what it led to, I'll show you in a moment. It's a really rich output that you get from PRFs. And then we had the group discussions using IAD board, or the online discussion board, which teased out that multidisciplinary team aspect of things, and who does what. Because one thing about this product was that it has to be prescribed by someone, but that person cannot administer it because it's in the form of intratumoral injection. So there's a whole layer of complexity where a trained surgeon or maybe an interventional radiologist would be the person who has to be bought in to that product to be finally injected. So there was that group dynamic happening, which we really wanted to understand properly. And as the final phase was again telephone interviews, which were used to test the hypotheses that came across from the previous two stages, as well as dig deeper into certain aspects and nuances, especially focusing on the unmet needs and drivers and barriers for the new product. So what kind of insights can we get from this? Of course, you get a patient journey map. You can map the flow of the patients from onset of symptoms to final outcome. But what you can get that really helps with a complex therapy space like a head and neck cancer is a treatment flow across lines of therapy. So when the patients arrive at the physician first, what are the different therapies that are prescribed, monotherapies as well as combinations, and once they fail on those therapies, how do they go to the next stage, and what therapies do they get there, and so on and so forth. And you can extend this out to whatever lines of therapy that a particular disease space gets treated with. So this is especially useful for oncology, this kind of visualization. Then we also map the patient journey in a more conventional manner, like in a flowchart manner, but the focus here was to map exactly what the key stakeholders are at each space. And by stakeholders, I mainly mean the decision drivers, right? We found that there was a lot of discussions happening in the multidisciplinary team. None of the major decisions were taken individually by any physicians. So there was a specialty play here, right? Like, for example, the oncologist might be prescribing it, but as I said, the head and neck surgeon or an interventional radiologist might be the one prescribing it. So that we could uncover that only when we did this kind of multidisciplinary, or rather multi-specialty discussion board. And finally, we also tested out a rudimentary or preliminary product profile, because anytime you do patient journey mapping, it's always good to get a read on the leverage points that can be then further studied in more detail in subsequent research to figure out exactly what the hurdles might be for the adoption of the product and how could you address them in the future. And that's essentially what we were able to deliver. So we had we could give them physician education campaign guidance, because along the patient journey you realize where these multidisciplinary team discussions may fall apart, what pieces of information they may want that they don't have about such a novel product. And that also fed into the clinical trial design for the next stage of the trial, because they had to figure out who exactly they need to involve in this trial, who would be the principal investigator, who would be a co-investigator, and so on. And we could also start kind of teasing out what the messaging focus need to be. Of course, there's a long way to go to actually developing messages and testing them, but this was an early read on what needs to be communicated to fill those gaps along the patient journey that pushes the physicians to take decisions that benefit the patient. So this is, I would say, one way of using multiple sources and triangulating them to come up with a multi-layered patient journey. But this is, I feel like, the basic multimodal approach. There's so much more we can do. So to talk about that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Sumi.
Thanks, Vin. Thanks, Vin. So we've seen, a case study here, and we've seen how we've leveraged multiple modalities to come up with a patient journey and the different considerations that we had here. But is that all? Is that all that we need to look at? There are other considerations. It was a bespoke solution at this point in time, but what goes behind coming up with that bespoke solution is something that we may want to reflect on. And we ask ourselves, why should we dig deeper and do more in patient journeys? We have to understand the nature of patient journeys. They are essentially longitudinal in nature. So it's a patient going through a longitudinal journey. It's a longitudinal map that starts at different points in time for each patient. So one patient would start at one point in time, the other patient would have already been on the disease journey at that point in time. And there could be various things that happen along the way. What are the different ways that we could go about mapping this longitudinality? Usually, or most of the times, we take a cross-section of patients. And if the sample size is large enough, we hope to capture different patients in different stages of their journey. And with profiling of different patient types, we can arrive at 2 years. A patient who's 2 years into the journey may look like this, or a patient who's 3 years into the journey may look like this. So that's one way of doing a patient journey, a single cross section. But then we could look at multiple cross sections in this case, and with multiple cross sections, you may be able to get a bit more richer information. It's not the same patient that you're tracking through the journey, but it may be different sets of different cross sections of patients that you're tracking through the journey. But you have a look back period on each cross section. And when you have a look back period, you're covering certain points that go along the journey. So that's one consideration to have. The other approach that one could look at is a claims data analysis, for example, or an electronic health records, medical records analysis. These are longitudinal databases. You can map a patient coming from from the diagnosis to the current state, along and map the longitudinality in that case. So that's a fairly simplistic approach, but sometimes it may be a choice of doing a cross section versus a longitudinal study, or sometimes it may be both. Now, the other question that one may want to ask is it a single study that we want to consider? Or is it multiple studies that we are looking at? So is it that we approach it from the point of view of a quantitative and qualitative physician survey or a patient survey? Or we bring in multiple modes, either within the same study or have multiple studies feeding into the same information. So there could be things like patient surveys, caregiver surveys, payer and health system research, database analysis, preference studies that could flow into the overall picture of the patient journey. Now, these patient journeys, as Vin pointed out, they have so many inputs and factors going into the journey. And there are lots of complex interactions that are happening along the journey. Now, these complex interactions, to study these complex interactions, sometimes you may require large sample sizes, because it's okay to describe it with a small sample size, but if you have to understand associations and explain why things are happening, then the sample sizes that you may want to look at may be pretty high. And the approach there could be, large quant surveys or, databases. But then there are cost implications there. So there is always a question of, where is the optimal return? Whether you're looking at, doing primary research on 500 or 1,000 patients, but then, if I spend the same amount of money, I can probably get 1 million patients on there with a database. So those are the questions that we may want to consider and try and answer those questions as we design what type of studies we require for studying the patient journey. So in summary, a multimodal approach is preferred over. It can provide a much more richer picture of the patient journey because patient journeys are by themselves very complex. It's like peeling the layers of an onion, and there could be different layers. It's a decision when you embark on the project. You may want to consider how deep do you want to go, how perfect you want to be, and how complex you want to make it. So that's the decision that you may want to take much earlier, and therefore try and get into either just the structural layer, which could be when does a patient present, to whom does a patient present, how does the patient flow move, maybe some things about decision points and drivers, include things like the experiential layer, where you're looking at pain points, preferences, patients' understanding of their disease, the inputs that the information that patient has. It goes into the decision making by the physician on the patient's treatment, and there could be the actionable layer where it's the support system of the ecosystem of the patient that is kind of influencing how the patient journey how the patient journey is approached. So, in summary, if one would want to look at a patient journey, it may one may have to look at multiple considerations, and what we have attempted to do here is provide a snapshot of those considerations. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes.
So I think what you described is more like a buying process, right? Because when I think of patient journeys, I'm typically thinking about emotions, how do people feel, and can you do both in one project? Because I'm not so sure that I typically like to do them separately.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, as you said, it's you would call them two projects because you have to talk to physicians for the buying process, and you have to talk to patients for the emotional part of the patient journey, right? So it could be done in a single flow. It could be done at separate points in time. But what we're trying to talk about here is that they by themselves, I mean, yes, we say we need a buying process, we need a patient journey, but when we want to really map the patient journey, we need to draw from both sources. So there has to be some, firstly, some upfront planning to figure out how the research outputs from the patient and the physician perspective can be put together in to create a coherent story. And then on the back end, you need that analysis and bringing together the outputs from both types of studies to create something that's a multi-layered, again, I would say calling it patient journey, but the idea is that it encapsulates the buying process as well as the patient's experiences as they go through it.
Because the buying process influences the journey.
Yeah. Maybe if I could ask a quick follow-up. Could you also talk to physicians to learn about the patient emotions, right? Because sometimes patients may not be able to articulate that necessarily, and vice versa, even talk to patients about some of the logistics first, and then getting into, okay, well, now that we spoke about that, let's talk about how you felt throughout that journey. Where were your kind of ups and downs, things like that.
Absolutely, exactly. We definitely do that. We want to get everyone's perspective, ideally, on everything, because it not only helps us, triangulate and see where it matches, but often it also shows us where it does not match, because we discover sometimes that physicians think that maybe the patients, they understand this very well. I remember a study that we had done where it was a rare condition that affects neurological and cognitive behavior or cognitive abilities in children, and their caregivers are essentially usually the ones who are instructed as to how to administer the medication, so that because these children are very hard to deal with in terms of medicating them, right? So the physicians, when we asked them about this education process, they were very confident that they're doing a great job. But when we asked the caregivers the same question, we got a very poor kind of scorecard for the physicians. So yes, both perspectives are important. Where the patients are not able to articulate their feelings, emotions, we usually go to carers. But we also do ask physicians what they see is happening, how they see it is happening, because sometimes it enforces what we hear from the other side, and sometimes it's so conflicting that that's a leverage point. That's a point you can educate the physicians on, that, hey, you're not actually doing as great a job as you think you are. Maybe here's some kind of educational material that you can pass on, or here's something we can show the physicians to educate themselves.
Yeah, or in some cases, it may not be just between the physician, patient, caregiver. So cognitive impairment, for example, the diagnosis of cognitive impairment, how is it made? Who diagnoses it? It's the physician usually tests for cognitive impairment. Someone else gives the signal. and that signal could be coming from mental health nurses, community nurses. So that's the puzzle that we're trying to solve here. If we consider those all those factors that may affect the journey, we will be able to map it out. Other questions?
Yeah, sorry, I was late, so you may have covered it. But what's the sort of, just if you could talk about how is this finally output is presented to the stakeholders, brand teams and others?
Yeah, of course. So can you go back to that slide? Right.
Okay,
No, I'm sorry, this one. Right. So, I mean, we essentially we have to be aligned on how deep do you want to go, right? It's as this onion analogy is exactly for that, because there's always a starting point to the patient journey mapping. That's the most superficial, and then the deeper you go, the more you uncover. So depending on how deep you want to go, or how deep you think we should go at any given point in time, we can create visualizations that kind of serve that purpose. So for the structural layer, it would be more in terms of simple flowcharts with decision tree diagrams, or they could be something like the Sankey diagram, where you see the patient's flow from one line of therapy to the next. And on that, we could then add a layer of the decision points and drivers or leverage points, which we could identify with just the most superficial structural layer. Once you go deeper and start talking about the experiential layer, then you have to use multiple different visualizations, where you start with the basic patient journey map and then zoom in on different aspects, go deeper there, talk about the experience of the patients, the emotions. You can have, we also show many times physician-patient exchanges, like what would be said by the patient, what the physician says in return, how the patient feels in reaction to that, and so on and so forth. And again, actionable there would be zooming out again a bit more, and over the map just showing where exactly we can potentially message, educate, identify a lack of connection between key stakeholders that does not exist now, but we need to cultivate. So it's starting with that map and then going for different visualizations to zoom in or zoom out at different places.
If I can follow up, or sorry.
Go ahead.
Follow up on that. So is that, what is your experience has been? Is it just sort of a hour-long presentation versus is there some sort of workshop getting them involved, and I don't know how you have, because this is obviously a foundational research, and how you communicate is also an important part of the work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'll leave the presentation part to Win, but what I would say is that it's very important to align stakeholders on how deep we want to go, what we want to look at. So for that, what you're suggesting, workshops, they really help. So it's the representation of the journey. That's something that comes much later. But it gets sorted out more or less, because what people want to see in the planning and design workshops to begin with.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I think the most important phase of, if you really want to go that deep, is to have the initial alignment on exactly what you want to capture. Because the deeper we dig, the more number of perspectives we need to bring in, the more methodologies we need to use, or add in databases and all that. So it really defines the design of the study, the level of investment needed, and all that. And once it's done, of course, if it's a more complex representation, then we would recommend maybe a couple of different presentations where we first only discuss the surface level, go a bit deeper, and then have another session where we would then go into real minutiae of the experiential and the actionable layers.